I hired a cleaning lady to clean my house. An hour after I left for work, she called me in a panicked whisper, asking if anyone else was supposed to be in the house besides my husband. Confused, I replied no and asked why. She told me there was a woman upstairs. I quietly drove back home, and what I found shattered my entire reality. My name is Naomi, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful crisis public relations director for Atlanta Black Elite, I thought I had escaped their toxicity by building my own empire. But I had no idea I had just married into a family that was infinitely worse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and tried to take what is yours. The morning started like any other high-stakes day at my public relations firm in downtown Atlanta. I was sitting at my mahogany desk, nursing my second cup of black coffee, while putting out a massive media fire for a prominent professional basketball player. He had made a reckless decision the night before, and it was my job to ensure his multi-million-dollar endorsement deals did not vanish into thin air. I am known in the industry as the fixer. People pay me exorbitant amounts of money to make their worst mistakes disappear, to control the narrative, and to protect their assets at all costs. I have spent my entire adult life building a reputation as a woman who never panics, a woman who always stays 10 steps ahead of the disaster. Little did I know the biggest crisis of my life was actively unfolding in my own primary bedroom. My phone vibrated on the desk. The caller identification showed it was Rosa. Rosa is a 50-year-old woman who has been managing my household for the past 3 years. She is fiercely loyal, incredibly observant, and treats my home with the utmost respect. I answered the call expecting her to ask a routine question about the grocery delivery or the dry cleaning schedule. Instead, I was met with heavy, uneven breathing. I asked her if everything was all right. Rosa lowered her voice to a barely audible whisper, her words trembling with genuine fear. She asked me if anyone else was supposed to be in the house today, besides my husband Darren. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Darren, my husband of 2 years, was a 35-year-old investment fund manager. He was supposed to be working from home today, taking calls in his downstairs office. I told Rosa that nobody else was supposed to be there. I asked her why she was whispering. Rosa took a shaky breath and told me she was currently hiding in the pantry off the kitchen. She said she had arrived at the house an hour after I left for work. While she was putting away the cleaning supplies, she heard unmistakable noises coming from the primary suite upstairs. Laughter, movement, and the very clear voice of a woman who was definitely not me. My professional instincts kicked in immediately. I did not scream. I did not cry. I assessed the threat. I told Rosa to quietly move to the laundry room, lock the heavy solid wood door, and stay completely silent until I told her it was safe to leave. I hung up the phone, calmly closed my laptop, and told my assistant to cancel my meetings for the next 2 hours. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the office with the same composed expression I wore when negotiating with hostile press outlets. The drive from my downtown office to my estate in Buckhead felt agonizingly slow. Atlanta traffic crawled, giving my mind too much time to race through the possibilities. Who was the woman upstairs? Was it a random encounter? Was it someone he met at his upscale fitness club? My mind analyzed Darren. He was always perfectly groomed, charming, the kind of man who commanded a room with his infectious smile and tailored suits. He came from a family that prided itself on appearances. His mother, Beatrice, was a 60-year-old matriarch who constantly bragged about her sons and their prestigious careers. They presented themselves as the ultimate Black excellence family, dripping in old Southern charm and new money arrogance. But I was the one who actually had the money. I bought the Buckhead estate before we even got married. I turned into my exclusive neighborhood, the grand oak trees casting long shadows over the manicured lawns. I did not pull into my own driveway. The roar of my sports utility vehicle would be a dead giveaway. Instead, I parked 2 streets over, slipping my keys into my designer bag and walking the rest of the way on foot. The Georgia heat pressed against my skin, but I felt nothing but ice-cold clarity. As I approached the wrought iron gates of my home, I pulled out my phone and accessed the smart home security application. I had personally paid for and designed this entire security grid. I knew every camera angle, every motion sensor, and every blind spot. I temporarily disabled the notifications for the exterior cameras and deactivated the chime on the side garage door. I slipped through the pedestrian gate and moved quietly along the side of the massive brick house. I let myself in through the garage, stepping softly into the mudroom. The house was dead silent, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning. I took off my heels, holding them in one hand, and walked in my bare feet across the cold marble floors. Every step was calculated. I moved past the kitchen, giving a silent nod toward the locked laundry room door where I knew Rosa was hiding. I reached the grand sweeping staircase in the foyer. My heart hammered against my ribs, a physical reaction to the betrayal I was about to confirm. As I ascended the carpeted stairs, the muffled sounds became clearer. It was not just laughter. It was the intimate, comfortable conversation of two people who knew each other very well. They were not rushing. They were lounging in my bed in my house, entirely comfortable in their deception. I reached the second-floor landing and moved down the hallway toward the primary suite. The door was left slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out onto the hardwood floor. They were so confident, so arrogant in their safety, that they did not even bother to pull the door shut. I stood there in the shadows of my own home, the place I had worked tirelessly to build, listening to the man I married destroy our vows. But I was not prepared for the true depth of the destruction. I was expecting a stranger. I was expecting a meaningless affair. What I found was a betrayal so profound and calculated that it shifted my entire worldview in a matter of seconds. I pressed my back against the wall outside the primary suite and raised my phone, hitting the record button on my audio application. I held my breath, slowly leaning forward, just enough to peer through the crack in the door. Lying in my custom king-sized bed, wrapped in my expensive linen sheets, was my husband, Darren. And resting her head on his bare chest was a woman I recognized instantly. It was Simone, my 30-year-old sister-in-law. Simone was married to Kendrick Darren's younger brother. She was a woman who made it her life mission to look down on me at every family gathering. Simone owned a supposedly high-end luxury fashion boutique in Midtown, a business she constantly flaunted as proof of her superior entrepreneurial skills. She loved to play the role of the perfect wealthy wife, always draped in designer labels, always making backhanded compliments about how my crisis public relations job was so stressful and unladylike. Seeing her in my bed sent a wave of nausea through my body, but I forced myself to remain completely still. The audio recorder captured every word as their casual post-intimacy conversation began. Simone trailed her perfectly manicured fingernails down Darren's chest and sighed heavily. She complained about her boutique. She said the latest inventory shipment was stuck in customs, and her suppliers were threatening to cut her off because she was behind on payments again. Darren kissed her forehead, telling her to relax. His voice, the same smooth, reassuring tone he used to calm my anxieties, made my skin crawl. He told Simone that he had already taken care of it. He explicitly stated that he had initiated a wire transfer of $200,000 from the joint investment account he shared with me, funneling it directly into a shell company that fed Simone's boutique. He promised her the funds would clear by tomorrow morning. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing to process the financial crime I was hearing. Darren was not just a cheating husband, he was embezzling money. He was an investment fund manager, someone trusted with millions of dollars, and he was secretly draining our joint funds to finance his brother's wife and her failing business. But the conversation did not stop there. It escalated into something far more sinister. Simone laughed a cruel, mocking sound. She asked Darren how long he was going to keep playing house with me. She complained that she was tired of sneaking around, tired of going home to Kendrick. She called Kendrick a weak, pathetic loser who only cared about his underground gambling debts. Darren chuckled and told Simone to be patient. He said the plan was almost complete. He mentioned his mother Beatrice, my mother-in-law. Beatrice, the woman who smiled in my face every Sunday at family dinners while serving sweet tea and cornbread. Darren revealed that Beatrice knew all about the affair. Not only did she know she was actively orchestrating a strategy to strip me of my assets, Darren explained the entire plot to Simone while my phone recorded every damning word. Beatrice had contacted the family lawyers to draft a set of documents disguised as an estate planning restructuring. They were going to present me with papers that would legally transfer the ownership of my Buckhead estate, the house I bought with my own hard-earned money, into an irrevocable family trust, controlled by Darren and Beatrice. Darren confidently told Simone that once I signed those papers, he was going to file for divorce. He would take half of everything I owned, legally secure the house under his family name, and then Simone could finally divorce Kendrick. They would live happily ever after on my dime. Simone sighed happily, praising Darren for being so brilliant. She asked if he thought I would actually sign the papers. Darren laughed arrogantly. He said I was so busy managing crises for other people that I never paid attention to my own finances. He called me a naive workaholic who trusted him completely. He said his mother was going to invite me to dinner this weekend to soften me up before he presented the documents. I stood in the hallway, the phone burning in my hand, as the recording captured their entire conspiracy. A weaker woman might have kicked the door open. A weaker woman might have screamed, thrown punches, and demanded answers. She might have cried over the betrayal of her husband and the cruel deception of her in-laws. But I am not a weaker woman. I am a crisis manager, and in that moment Darren and Simone ceased to be my family. They became hostile liabilities. They became targets. I silently tapped the screen to stop the recording and saved the file to a secure cloud server. I did not make a single sound as I backed away from the bedroom door. I retraced my steps down the grand staircase, my bare feet gliding silently over the marble. I moved with absolute precision, my mind already building a comprehensive strategy to destroy them completely. I reached the kitchen and pulled out my phone. I sent a quick text message to Rosa, telling her the coast was clear and instructing her to slip out through the back patio doors and take the day off with full pay. I told her I would explain everything later, but to act as if she had never arrived. I watched from the hallway as the laundry room door quietly opened and Rosa hurried out the back, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Once Rosa was gone, I slipped back out through the garage side door, ensuring it locked silently behind me. I reactivated the exterior security cameras just as I stepped off the property, returning the smart home system to its normal state. I walked the 2 blocks back to my parked sports utility vehicle, the Georgia sun beating down on my shoulders, but my blood running absolute zero. When I got into the driver's seat, I did not cry. I started the engine and drove straight back to my office in downtown Atlanta. My assistant looked surprised when I walked back through the glass doors, noting that my brief absence had supposedly been for a personal errand. I sat back down at my mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and took a sip of the coffee I had abandoned an hour earlier. It was cold and bitter, much like the reality I had just uncovered. I pulled up my private financial portfolios and began securing my accounts. Darren thought I was a naive workaholic, but he severely underestimated the protective measures I took before walking down the aisle. He did not know about the blind trust. He did not know about the corporate entities I used to purchase my real estate. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, trying to jump my pieces and steal my crown. He had no idea he had just forced me to flip the entire board. The war had begun, and I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, the entire fraudulent empire his family built would be burned to ash. The following Friday evening, my dining room became the battleground. I hired a private chef, setting the long mahogany table with my finest crystal. Darren stood near the custom-built wet bar, pouring bourbon for his younger brother Kendrick. Kendrick looked characteristically exhausted, sporting a wrinkled designer shirt he likely could not afford. Darren slapped him on the back, playing the role of the generous older sibling. I watched them from the kitchen threshold, smoothing down my tailored emerald green dress. I took a slow breath, letting my professional crisis management persona lock into place. It was time to perform. The doorbell chimed, signaling the arrival of Beatrice and Simone. Darren hurried to open it, greeting his mother with exaggerated affection. Beatrice stepped into the foyer, wearing a vintage suit that had seen better decades. She looked around my house with her usual critical gaze scanning for dust. Behind her walked Simone, dripping in visible brand logos and an aura of unearned superiority. Around her neck rested a heavy diamond pendant. My eyes locked onto the stones, catching the entryway light. That necklace cost $50,000. I knew whose money paid for it. I stepped forward, pasting a welcoming smile onto my face. I embraced Beatrice, feeling her stiffen slightly as she offered a hollow compliment about my dress. I turned to Simone, giving her a brief hug. Up close, I could smell Darren's signature cologne lingering on her skin. My stomach churned, but my smile never wavered. I complimented her necklace, telling her how breathtaking the diamonds looked. Simone preened, touching the stones with greedy fingers, boasting that her boutique had a profitable quarter. Darren looked down at his shoes, taking a gulp of bourbon. I simply nodded, praising her business acumen while mentally calculating federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud. We moved into the formal dining room. Beatrice immediately claimed the seat at the head of the table opposite Darren, a deliberate power play she executed at every gathering. I took my seat next to Darren, playing the gracious, accommodating wife. The private chef began serving the first course, a delicate sea bass carpaccio. The clinking of silver forks against fine china filled the room, followed by Beatrice initiating her customary psychological warfare. Beatrice dabbed her lips with a napkin and looked directly at me. She asked how my little public relations job was going, making sure to emphasize the word little. She sighed dramatically, stating it must be exhausting cleaning up other people's messes. She lamented that a woman should focus on building her husband up and maintaining a proper home rather than chasing scandals. Kendrick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Darren offered a weak defense, saying I was good at my job, but fell silent when Beatrice shot him a warning glare. I kept my posture perfectly straight, cutting a small piece of fish. I smiled warmly at Beatrice, agreeing that my work was demanding, but noting that someone had to protect high-net-worth individuals from the consequences of their reckless greed. I let my eyes drift casually toward Darren, watching a bead of sweat form at his hairline. Beatrice scoffed, pivoting her attention to Simone with a triumphant smile. She loudly praised Simone, calling her the ideal modern woman. Beatrice went on a tangent about how Simone perfectly balanced traditional wifely duties with running a thriving luxury boutique. She commended Simone for supporting Kendrick while building a respectable brand the family could be proud of. Simone soaked up the praise. She sat up straighter, swirling the red wine in her crystal glass. She tossed her hair back and started boasting about her recent inventory acquisitions. She claimed her brand was attracting high-level investors who believed in her vision. She talked about opening a second location in Miami, dropping business buzzwords she clearly did not understand. She painted a picture of financial triumph, casting condescending glances my way to ensure I felt the weight of her superiority. I listened attentively, chewing my food with deliberate slowness. I let her finish her grand monologue about profit margins and brand expansion. I took a sip of my sparkling water, setting the glass down with a gentle clink. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and adopted an expression of professional concern. I told Simone that her success was inspiring, especially given the current economic climate in the luxury retail sector. I lowered my voice, mimicking the confidential tone I used when advising clients. I mentioned she should be incredibly careful with new investors. Simone frowned, her smug expression faltering. She asked what I meant by that. I kept my gaze locked softly on hers. I explained that my firm was managing a crisis for a prominent retail CEO. I casually dropped the information that the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the Internal Revenue Service, had launched a sweeping crackdown on luxury boutiques in the Atlanta area. I noted that federal agents were targeting businesses that showed sudden mysterious cash injections that did not align with actual sales revenue. The dining room went dead silent. I continued, my voice smooth and conversational. I explained that the feds were tracking these cash injections back to fraudulent wire transfers and shell companies used for embezzlement. I shook my head sympathetically, stating that penalties for receiving embezzled funds, carried a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison. I said the government was seizing all assets purchased with stolen money, including houses, cars, and jewelry. Simone froze completely. Her eyes widened in absolute terror. Her hand holding her crystal wine glass began to tremble uncontrollably. She tried to set the glass down, but her motor skills failed her. The glass tipped over, crashing against the mahogany table. A dark red stain spread rapidly across the white linen tablecloth, pooling around her expensive designer plate. Kendrick jumped up, cursing under his breath, grabbing his napkin to sop up the mess. Beatrice gasped, scolding Simone for her clumsiness. I did not look at the spilled wine. I looked at Darren. My husband was sitting rigid in his chair. All the color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He was staring at me with a look of pure panic. His chest was rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to draw breath. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. I offered Darren a sweet smile. I asked him if he was feeling all right, noting that he looked a bit pale. I placed my hand gently over his, feeling the cold sweat on his skin. I told him he worked entirely too hard managing his investment fund and needed to be careful not to stress himself into an early grave. Darren yanked his hand away from mine as if he had been burned. He stammered, pulling at the collar of his shirt, claiming the room was suddenly too warm. He abruptly stood up, nearly knocking his chair over, and announced he needed to step outside to take a work call. He sprinted out of the dining room, disappearing down the hallway. I turned my attention back to Simone. She was frantically dabbing at the wine stain on her dress, her breathing shallow and erratic. The arrogant woman from 5 minutes ago was gone. In her place sat a terrified criminal, realizing the walls were closing in. Her hand moved involuntarily to her neck, clutching the diamond pendant, as if it were suddenly burning her skin. Beatrice, oblivious to the panic unfolding around her, loudly complained about the disruption. She ordered Rosa, who had quietly entered the room to assist with the spill, to fetch club soda immediately. Beatrice sighed, apologizing to me for Simone destroying my expensive linens. I waved my hand dismissively, signaling to Rosa that everything was fine. I looked directly into Simone's panicked eyes and offered a serene smile. I told Beatrice not to worry about the table. I said stains were simply a part of life, and fortunately, I was an absolute expert at making dirty messes disappear without a trace. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. Darren returned to the table, downing 3 glasses of bourbon in rapid succession. He barely spoke, jumping every time my phone buzzed with a notification. Simone pushed her food around her plate, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her fork. She kept shooting terrified, questioning glances at Darren, but he refused to make eye contact with her. Kendrick remained oblivious to the underlying terror, happily eating his steak and complaining about a recent losing streak at his poker club. Beatrice, annoyed by the sudden lack of engaging conversation, tried to steer the topic toward the charity gala she wanted to host. This was my opening. I leaned into the conversation, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law seeking redemption. I told Beatrice that hosting a grand charity gala was a brilliant idea. I suggested we host it right here at my estate in Buckhead next Saturday night. I promised to use all my professional connections to invite the wealthiest, most influential figures in Atlanta's elite circles. Beatrice's eyes lit up with greedy delight. She immediately began listing the prominent families and politicians she wanted to invite, eager to show off her son's supposed wealth and secure her status at the top of the social hierarchy. Darren tried to protest weakly, suggesting that a massive party might be too stressful right now. But Beatrice quickly silenced him, insisting this gala would elevate the family name to unprecedented heights. I smiled at my husband, my eyes locked dead on his pale, sweating face. I told him his mother was right. I promised Darren that this gala would be an unforgettable night, a spectacular event that would expose our family's true character to the entire city. I watched him swallow hard, completely unaware that he had just agreed to host his own public execution. The trap was flawlessly set, and soon the entire fake empire they built together would inevitably crumble into absolute dust before their eyes. The morning after the dinner party began with the distinct sound of Darren rushing out of the house. He bypassed his usual morning routine, skipping the artisanal coffee and avoiding my gaze entirely. He grabbed his briefcase and muttered a frantic excuse about an emergency client meeting before bolting through the garage door. I watched his car speed down the driveway from the primary suite window, taking a slow sip of my green tea. He was running scared, terrified by the financial ghost stories I had spun at the dining table, desperately trying to cover his tracks. But he was already too late. I dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit, pulled my hair back into a severe knot, and drove to my downtown office. The atmosphere in my firm was electric as always, but today my focus was entirely personal. My crisis management agency was built on discretion, ruthlessness, and an unparalleled network of investigators. Usually I deployed these resources to save politicians caught in scandals or athletes facing extortion. Today my firm had a new highly classified client. Me. I walked past my assistant and instructed her to cancel all external meetings for the next 48 hours. I locked the door to my private conference room and made a secure call to Marcus. Marcus was not just a forensic accountant, he was a financial predator. He could find a hidden penny in a billionaire's labyrinth of offshore accounts. I had him on a permanent retainer for my high-profile clients, but today I needed him to dissect my own husband. When Marcus arrived, I handed him a cloned copy of Darren's hard drive. I had extracted it while Darren was heavily sedated by bourbon the previous night. I also provided Marcus with full access to our joint financial portfolio's tax returns and the specific routing numbers I had memorized from the audio recording of Darren and Simone. I looked Marcus directly in the eye and told him to tear Darren's financial life apart piece by piece. I wanted every transaction, every hidden account, and every dirty secret dragged out into the harsh light. Marcus did not ask questions. He simply plugged the drive into a secure terminal and went to work. For 2 agonizing days, I maintained my normal routine at home, playing the oblivious, loving wife. I asked Darren how his stressful week was going, rubbing his tense shoulders while he stared blankly at the television. He was sweating through his shirts, constantly checking his phone, visibly cracking under the pressure of the federal investigation I had completely fabricated. He was jumping at shadows, completely unaware that the real threat was sitting right next to him on the custom Italian leather sofa. On Wednesday afternoon, Marcus called me down to the secure server room. The massive digital screens dominating the wall were covered in complex flowcharts, highlighted bank statements, and offshore routing numbers. Marcus looked at me taking off his glasses and stated that the situation was far worse than a simple marital betrayal. Darren was not just cheating on me. He was orchestrating a massive, systematic financial crime. Marcus pointed to a cluster of red lines connecting Darren's corporate accounts to a series of dummy corporations. The $200,000 Darren transferred to Simone's boutique was merely a drop in the ocean. Marcus revealed that Darren had been embezzling directly from his high-net-worth clients for the past 3 years. He was siphoning capital from their escrow accounts, falsifying quarterly return statements to hide the missing principal, and funneling the stolen wealth into a shadow account. This shadow account was the lifeblood of Simone's entire existence. Her luxury boutique, which she constantly paraded as a triumph of female entrepreneurship, was nothing but a money-laundering front. The inventory shipments, the sudden cash injections, the lavish lifestyle she rubbed in my face at every family gathering, all of it was financed by stolen money. Darren was risking federal prison to keep his brother's wife dripping in diamonds and designer labels. The sheer audacity of his crime was staggering, but it gave me the exact ammunition I needed to bury him permanently. However, Marcus was not finished. He pulled up a separate financial web on the adjacent screen. This one tracked a series of untraceable high-volume cash withdrawals moving from Darren's shadow account into various underground sports betting syndicates. I frowned, analyzing the data. Darren was not a gambler. He was too obsessed with control to risk his money on games of chance. Marcus cross-referenced the digital footprints and linked the betting accounts directly to Kendrick, Simone's husband, Darren's younger brother. The realization hit me like a physical blow, snapping the final pieces of this toxic family puzzle into place. Kendrick knew. He knew about the affair between his wife and his older brother. He had likely known for months, But instead of confronting them, instead of exhibiting a single ounce of self-respect or family loyalty, Kendrick had weaponized his wife's infidelity. He was using the affair to blackmail Darren. Darren was systematically paying off Kendrick's massive, crippling underground gambling debts to buy his silence. It was a grotesque circle of extortion and depravity. Darren was stealing from his clients to fund Simone's fake business, while simultaneously paying off Kendrick's illicit debts, so Kendrick would turn a blind eye to the affair. And sitting at the top of this diseased family tree was Beatrice, managing her sons, perfectly content with the rot spreading through her family as long as everyone kept up their wealthy, elite appearances. They were all complicit. They were all parasites feeding off each other's corruption, and they had foolishly decided to try and feed off me. I thanked Marcus, instructing him to compile every single piece of evidence into a legally verified encrypted dossier. I needed hard copies, digital backups, and an ironclad chain of custody for the documents. I was not just going to divorce Darren. I was going to hand him over to the federal government wrapped in a bow. Leaving the server room, I immediately dialed Diane, my ruthless corporate attorney. Diane was a shark in a tailored skirt suit, the woman who handled all my high-level corporate structuring. I drove straight to her office in Midtown, bypassing the pleasantries the moment I walked through her heavy glass doors. I sat across from her desk and outlined Beatrice and Darren's impending trap. I explained their plan to present me with fraudulent estate restructuring documents designed to trick me into signing away my home to their fake family trust. Diane listened intently, taking rapid notes, a predatory smile slowly forming on her face. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her it was time to activate the ultimate defense protocol. Before Darren and I ever exchanged vows, I had taken strict measures to protect the empire I built. I never believed in mingling my hard-earned assets with anyone else's potential liabilities. When I purchased the sprawling Buckhead estate, I did not put the deed in my name, and I certainly never put it in Darren's name. The property was legally owned by my primary limited liability company, Phoenix Holdings. Furthermore, Phoenix Holdings was shielded within a pre-marital blind trust that I controlled exclusively. Darren's name only existed on a few basic utility bills to satisfy his fragile male ego. I instructed Diane to execute an immediate, impenetrable legal lockdown on Phoenix Holdings. We drafted highly restrictive corporate resolutions that permanently blocked any transfer of assets without the unanimous consent of a board of directors, a board comprised entirely of my hand-picked legal and financial proxies. We solidified the corporate veil, ensuring that Phoenix Holdings was an absolute fortress. Diane explained the beauty of this maneuver. Even if Darren and Beatrice managed to forge my signature on their fraudulent trust documents, or if they tried to coerce me into signing them under false pretenses, the paperwork would be completely void. Legally speaking, I did not possess the individual authority to transfer the deed to the Buckhead estate because I did not technically own it as an individual. Phoenix Holdings owned it. Their entire scheme to steal my house was legally impossible, a foolish fantasy drafted by amateurs who severely underestimated their target. We spent the next 5 hours reinforcing every wall of my financial fortress. I drained my personal capital from any accounts Darren had visibility into, moving the funds into newly established, secure corporate entities. I left only a nominal amount of money in our joint checking account, just enough to cover standard weekly expenses, so Darren would not notice the sudden evaporation of wealth. I changed the beneficiaries on my life insurance policies, updated my power of attorney, and severed every single legal tie linking my professional empire to Darren's sinking ship. By the time I left Diane's office, the sun had set over the Atlanta skyline. I sat in the plush leather seat of my vehicle, staring out at the city lights. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. The pain of the betrayal had been completely replaced by the cold, mechanical precision of impending vengeance. I was legally untouchable. My assets were secured behind layers of corporate armor. I possessed irrefutable proof of Darren's federal crimes, Simone's complicity, and Kendrick's extortion. I drove back to the Buckhead estate, pulling into the garage and listening to the engine cut out. I walked into the house, greeted by Darren, who was pacing the kitchen nervously, clutching a glass of water. He offered a strained smile, asking how my day at the office was. He looked haggard, a man carrying the weight of a dozen dirty secrets. I walked right up to him, straightening his collar with perfectly manicured fingers. I smiled brightly, looking deep into his lying eyes. I told him my day was incredibly productive. I said everything was falling perfectly into place for the charity gala this weekend. I promised him it was going to be the most important night of our lives. He exhaled a shaky breath, completely blind to the guillotine hanging directly over his neck. I walked upstairs to prepare for the gala, ready to burn their world to the ground. Thursday evening arrived with a suffocating humidity. I was in the kitchen arranging white hydrangeas when Darren walked in. He leaned against the marble island, attempting a posture of relaxed confidence, but the tight grip on his scotch glass betrayed his nerves. He cleared his throat, asking if I had a few minutes to step into his office. He said there was some tedious financial housekeeping we needed to clear up before the weekend. I placed the final stem into the vase, wiped my hands, and gave him a bright smile. I followed him down the hallway, into his custom mahogany office. The room smelled of expensive leather-aged bourbon and underlying desperation. On his desk sat a thick stack of legal documents with yellow sticky notes pointing to signature lines. Darren took a seat behind his desk, gesturing for me to sit opposite him. He folded his hands, resting them on the paperwork, and launched into a highly rehearsed monologue. He started by telling me how much he loved me, how hard we worked, and how important it was to secure our legacy. He spoke in a smooth, rhythmic cadence, the exact voice he used to charm millions out of his high-net-worth investors. He told me that we needed to be smarter about our asset allocation. He said he had been consulting with his mother and her estate attorneys, and they all agreed that the smartest move was a comprehensive asset restructuring. I sat perfectly still, maintaining an expression of polite curiosity. I listened as he wove a masterful web of financial jargon and manipulative affection. He explained that placing the Buckhead estate into a newly formed family trust would protect us from corporate liability and capital gains taxes. He spun a beautiful fantasy about protecting our unborn children and securing our lifestyle. He gently pushed the stack of papers across the desk, handing me a heavy gold fountain pen. He pointed to the first yellow sticky note, telling me that if I just signed these preliminary transfer agreements, his legal team would handle the tedious filing details. I looked down at the documents. The header boldly proclaimed the creation of the Darren and Beatrice Legacy Trust. It was exactly what he had discussed with Simone in my bed. He was looking me right in the eye, smiling warmly, actively trying to steal the home I paid for while planning his divorce and subsequent life with his brother's wife. The sociopathic audacity of his presentation was almost impressive. I did not pick up the gold pen. Instead, I gently pulled the stack of papers toward me, flipping through the first few pages with feigned confusion. I furrowed my brow, adopting the persona of a brilliant public relations director who was hopelessly out of her depth with complex real estate law. I looked back up at Darren, my eyes wide and trusting. I told him this all sounded incredibly smart and responsible. I praised his financial foresight, telling him how lucky I was to have a husband who worked so hard to protect our future. Darren visibly relaxed his shoulders, dropping as a triumphant smirk played at the corners of his mouth. He urged me to go ahead and sign, claiming the courier was waiting to take the documents straight to the courthouse before the weekend filing deadline. I smiled sweetly, tapping my manicured nails against the thick paper. I told him I would absolutely sign them, but I had a strict, unbreakable policy mandated by my corporate board. I explained that my public relations firm required my personal attorney, Diane, to review any document that altered my asset profile, ensuring no conflicts of interest with my high-profile clients. I kept my voice light and apologetic, blaming corporate bureaucracy for the delay. I promised him I would have Diane look it over first thing tomorrow morning and sign it immediately. Darren's triumphant smirk vanished. Panic crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by irritation. He pressed the issue, insisting Diane was a corporate lawyer, not an estate specialist, and his mother's attorneys were the best in Atlanta. He argued that delaying the filing could cost us thousands in tax penalties. I held my ground with flawless grace. I stood up from the chair, clutching the fraudulent documents against my chest. I walked around the desk, leaned down, and kissed him softly on the cheek. I whispered that he had nothing to worry about, reassuring him that we were a team and I trusted him completely. I told him Diane was just a formality and I would have the signed papers back to him in no time. I turned and walked out of his office, feeling his frustrated gaze burning into my back. The moment I heard the front door close as Darren left for his evening squash game, my entire demeanor changed. The naive wife vanished, replaced by an apex predator ready to strike. I marched upstairs to my private, secure study and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I dropped Beatrice's worthless legal documents into the shredder, listening to the satisfying hum of the blades destroying their pathetic scheme. I booted up my encrypted workstation and pulled up the colossal dossier Marcus and I had compiled. The evidence was staggering. It was a complete armory. I organized the data into pristine, undeniable categories. The first folder contained the offshore routing numbers, the shell company registrations, and the exact wire transfer logs showing Darren siphoning client funds into Simone's luxury boutique account. The second folder contained the digital footprints connecting Darren's hidden accounts to Kendrick's underground gambling syndicate, proving the extortion and the illegal payoff structure. The third folder held the audio file of Darren explicitly detailing his intent to commit wire fraud and property theft with the full knowledge of his mother. I did not just compile the data, I constructed a compelling, undeniable narrative of systemic multi-million-dollar federal crime. I highlighted the exact statutes Darren was violating. I highlighted the tax evasion elements for Simone's boutique. I made the case so perfectly packaged that a first-year federal prosecutor could win it blindfolded. Using a highly secure virtual private network, I accessed the online whistleblower portals for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I uploaded the entire dossier, sending the data packets directly into the hands of the most ruthless financial regulators on the planet. I submitted the tips anonymously, ensuring my digital fingerprints were entirely erased. I knew how the federal government worked. They loved cases handed to them on a silver platter, especially when the targets were arrogant investment managers. The trap was set. The federal gears were officially in motion, but an anonymous arrest was not good enough for me. I wanted a spectacle. I wanted a public execution. I wanted the entire city of Atlanta to watch the destruction of the family that tried to destroy me. I needed to gather all of them in one place, surround them with the very elite society they worshipped, and pull the rug out from under them while the cameras were rolling. I picked up my phone and dialed Beatrice. She answered on the second ring, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I matched her tone, infusing my voice with breathless excitement. I told her I had been thinking about the charity gala we discussed at dinner. I said our family had been so blessed with Darren's recent business success and Simone's thriving boutique that we had a moral obligation to give back. I pitched my vision for the event. A massive black tie masquerade gala hosted right here at the Buckhead Estate next Saturday night. I promised to hire the best event planners and secure an exclusive guest list of Atlanta's most powerful politicians, corporate chief executive officers, and elite socialites. I told Beatrice we would position the gala as a celebration of family unity. Beatrice eagerly swallowed the bait. I could hear the greedy delight in her voice as she calculated the immense social capital this event would bring her. She agreed instantly, demanding that we secure the top-tier society photographers to document her grand entrance. She promised to coordinate with Darren and Kendrick to ensure the entire family was presented flawlessly. I hung up the phone and smiled at my reflection in the dark window of my study. Darren and Beatrice thought they were using this gala to elevate their societal standing and soften me up for their financial slaughter. They had absolutely no idea they had just eagerly accepted invitations to their own funeral. The stage was set, the audience was secured, and the federal agents were tracking the scent of blood. Next Saturday night, the masks would come off, and I would leave them with nothing but ruins. The absolute destruction of their fraudulent empire was finally drawing near. The The following Saturday evening, my Buckhead estate was completely unrecognizable. The transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. I had hired Atlanta's premier event design firm to execute my vision of a grand masquerade gala, and they had spared absolutely no expense. The sprawling manicured lawns were illuminated by hundreds of floating lanterns and string lights woven intricately through the ancient oak trees. Valet attendants in crisp black uniforms lined the circular driveway, ready to receive the massive fleet of luxury vehicles that would soon pour through the wrought iron gates. Inside the massive foyer and formal living areas were draped in rich velvet fabrics of midnight blue and gold. Massive floral installations of white orchids and deep red roses towered over the imported crystal serving tables. A live string quartet positioned on the grand staircase landing filled the air with classical renditions of modern rhythm and blues hits. It was the perfect stage for a tragedy. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of Atlanta's absolute upper echelon. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city's black elite began to arrive in full glamour. There were powerful politicians, corporate chief executive officers, renowned athletes, and high society influencers. Everyone wore elaborate custom-designed masquerade masks that obscured their faces but amplified their wealth. Diamonds sparkled under the warm ambient lighting, and the scent of expensive perfumes and aged scotch filled the rooms. I stood near the entryway, wearing a sleek, custom-fitted obsidian gown and a delicate gold mask that covered only my eyes. I was the architect of this entire evening, yet I played my role as the gracious, accommodating hostess with absolute perfection. Beatrice arrived early, and true to form, she immediately attempted to commandeer the entire event. She swept through the front doors wearing a garish silver gown and a feathered mask that looked heavy and ridiculous. Darren and Kendrick flanked her like loyal foot soldiers. Beatrice took one look around the stunningly decorated foyer, and her eyes widened with greedy delight. However, instead of thanking me or acknowledging my hard work, she instantly slipped into her preferred role of treating me like the hired help in my own home. She snapped her fingers at me, demanding to know why the caterers had not yet circulated the crab cakes she specifically requested. She ordered me to adjust the lighting in the dining room, claiming it was too dim to properly showcase the towering ice sculpture. She paraded Darren and Kendrick through the growing crowd of wealthy guests, loudly introducing them to local politicians and prominent investors. She boasted about Darren's supposedly brilliant financial mind and Kendrick's non-existent business ventures. She acted as if she owned the estate, gesturing expansively to the architecture and the art on the walls, implicitly claiming my success as her family's legacy. I absorbed every single slight with a serene, unwavering smile. Whenever Beatrice snapped a petty order at me, I simply nodded gracefully and signaled to the event staff to handle it. I fetched her a glass of vintage champagne myself, ensuring her glass was never empty. I watched her parade her sons around, noting how eagerly the local elite swallowed her fabricated tales of generational wealth. They were all wearing literal masks tonight, but the metaphorical masks my husband and his family wore were far more dangerous. I played the naive, overworked wife perfectly. I let Beatrice believe she was the undisputed queen of the castle. I let her feel the intoxicating rush of absolute power, knowing that the higher she climbed tonight, the harder the concrete floor of reality would shatter her bones. The energy in the room shifted noticeably when Simone finally made her grand entrance. She walked through the heavy mahogany double doors on Kendrick's arm, arriving fashionably late to ensure maximum attention. Simone was wearing a plunging crimson silk dress that clung tightly to her figure, paired with a matching red lace mask. But it was not the dress that caught the collective eye of the room. It was the jewelry resting against her collarbone. Around her neck was a breathtaking, blindingly bright diamond tennis necklace. The stones were massive, perfectly cut, and caught the light of the chandeliers with aggressive brilliance. It was a statement piece, the kind of jewelry you keep locked in a bank vault and only wear to royal coronations. As she glided into the foyer, conversations momentarily paused. Women stared in barely concealed envy, while men offered appreciative nods. Simone soaked up the attention like a sponge, tossing her hair back, and resting a proprietary hand on Kendrick's chest. I stared at the necklace, my mind instantly accessing the financial data Marcus had uncovered. I knew exactly what that piece of jewelry was. I knew the designer, I knew the carat weight, and I knew the exact retail price. $50,000. It was a custom piece from a highly exclusive jeweler in Buckhead, a jeweler whose bank routing numbers had appeared in the forensic audit just days ago. I smoothly navigated through the crowd of laughing, drinking guests, keeping a careful eye on Simone as she proudly displayed her stolen treasure. I made my way toward the catering preparation area in the back of the house. Rosa was there managing the catering staff with her usual fierce efficiency. I had brought Rosa back into the fold after sending her away on the day of my discovery. I had not told her the full details of my plan, but I had confided enough to secure her absolute loyalty. Rosa knew Darren was a monster, and she was more than willing to help me set the trap. I pulled Rosa into the quiet hallway just outside the kitchen pantry. I kept my voice low, maintaining my bright hostess smile in case any guests wandered past. I asked Rosa to confirm what I was seeing. I asked her if she had noticed the new necklace Simone was parading around the living room. Rosa nodded grimly, her dark eyes flashing with disgust. She whispered that she had seen it the moment Simone walked in. Rosa had a sharp memory and a keen eye for luxury goods, having worked in high-end households for decades. She confirmed my suspicions. She told me she had seen an empty velvet box from that exact exclusive jeweler sitting in Darren's home office trash can earlier this week. She said the box had been hastily shoved underneath a pile of shredded paper. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place with a sickening click. I leaned closer to Rosa, my voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper. I told her the price of that necklace was exactly $50,000. I told her that 3 days ago, I intercepted a wire transfer from Darren's shadow account. The transfer was for exactly $50,000, routed from a client's escrow fund directly to that specific jeweler. Darren had not just bought his mistress a lavish gift. He had actively embezzled a massive sum of money from a trusting investor to put diamonds on his brother's wife's neck. And now she was wearing the evidence of a federal crime to a party filled with the very people Darren relied on for his business. Rosa gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. The sheer brazen arrogance of the act was difficult to comprehend. Darren was standing in my living room, sipping my expensive bourbon, watching his mistress flaunt a $50,000 felony in front of God, my family, and his wealthiest clients. He felt so untouchable, so protected by his mother's toxic matriarchy and his own narcissistic delusions that he believed he could commit grand larceny in broad daylight without facing a single consequence. I thanked Rosa, instructing her to ensure the champagne continued flowing freely to Beatrice and Darren. I wanted their inhibitions completely lowered. I wanted them drunk on alcohol and drunk on their own perceived power. I patted Rosa's shoulder and smoothed down the skirt of my obsidian gown. I turned and walked back into the glittering, noisy heart of the masquerade gala. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and heavy, like the humid Georgia night outside. To the untrained eye, it was a wildly successful high society gathering. The music was lively, the laughter was loud, and the elite guests were thoroughly entertained. But beneath the surface, a deadly psychological current was pulling everyone toward the edge of a cliff. I glided through the room, stopping to chat with city council members and corporate executives. I played the part of the gracious, charming host, but my eyes never stopped tracking my targets. I watched Darren schmoozing with an older, wealthy investor. The investor was smiling clearly, charmed by Darren's polished facade. Darren laughed at a joke, taking a long sip of his drink, his eyes constantly darting across the room to check on Simone. Simone was standing near the grand fireplace, completely ignoring her husband Kendrick, who was busy downing cocktails near the wet bar. She was showing off her necklace to a group of older socialites, spinning some fabricated lie about how well her boutique was performing to justify the extravagant purchase. She looked so proud, so deeply satisfied with her stolen wealth. She looked across the room and made direct eye contact with Darren. They shared a secret conspiratorial smile. It was a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance, I stood in the center of the room, sipping my sparkling water, feeling the cool condensation against my palm. The noise of the party faded into a low, buzzing hum in my ears. I was completely surrounded by people, yet my focus was singular and razor-sharp. The trap was fully set. The bait had been taken. The federal authorities were already reviewing the digital dossier I had sent them. Everything was perfectly aligned. I looked at the grandfather clock standing tall near the entryway. The ornate hands ticked steadily forward, marking the final minutes of their fake reality. Beatrice was laughing loudly near the courtyard doors. Kendrick was stumbling slightly, clearly intoxicated. Simone was touching her diamond necklace, her eyes sparkling with greed. Darren was shaking hands with a man whose money he had likely stolen. They were all performing their roles flawlessly, completely oblivious to the fact that the stage was rigged with explosives. I took a slow, deep, and highly calculated breath, letting the intoxicating calm before the inevitable storm wash completely over me. The execution was imminent, and I was ready to bring the heavy hammer down on all of them. The sharp chime of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute cut through the low hum of the ballroom. Beatrice stood at the center of the grand staircase landing, having positioned herself precisely where the ambient lighting would cast her in a golden, angelic glow. She signaled the string quartet to cease playing with a flick of her wrist. The music faded into a hesitant silence, replaced by the collective rustle of expensive silk and the turning of hundreds of masked faces toward the matriarch. I stepped back into the shadows of a towering marble pillar near the conservatory doors. I rested my shoulder against the cool stone, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room. I could see the city mayor standing near the ice sculpture. I could see a prominent federal judge holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres. I could see the chief executive officers of 3 major Atlanta banks mingling near the bar. This was the audience Beatrice and Darren had demanded. This was the jury they had unknowingly assembled for their own trial. Beatrice cleared her throat, holding the microphone a technician had hastily provided. She smiled a wide, practiced expression that radiated false warmth. She thanked everyone for attending this magnificent gathering, claiming it was a profound honor to host the very best and brightest of Atlanta under one roof. She spoke of legacy. She spoke of the importance of building a name that would echo through generations, referencing her late husband and the supposed financial empire he had left behind. The crowd offered polite murmuring agreement, captivated by her performative grace. Then the tone of her voice shifted. The false warmth hardened into something sharp and deliberate. She gripped the microphone tighter, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked directly onto me. Even behind my gold mask, she knew exactly where I was standing. She told the audience that achieving true greatness requires absolute dedication. She let out a dramatic, sorrowful sigh, shaking her head. She said it was a tragedy how modern society has lost sight of traditional values. She stated, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, that too many women today prioritize their own selfish, cutthroat ambitions over the sacred duty of building up their families. She lamented that some partners treat marriage like a corporate transaction, constantly hunting for scandals and managing crises for strangers while neglecting the very real needs of their own husbands. The silence in the room grew heavy and uncomfortable. Several guests shifted awkwardly, exchanging knowing glances behind their masks. Everyone in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. My reputation as a ruthless crisis manager was well known in these circles. Beatrice was executing a public, thinly veiled assassination of my character, attempting to paint me as a cold, neglectful wife who was actively holding her brilliant son back from his true potential. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I offered her a serene, unbothered smile from the shadows. Her petty insults were nothing but dust in the wind compared to the federal indictments I had already set in motion. Beatrice turned away from me, pivoting her attention to the opposite side of the staircase where Simone and Kendrick stood. Her harsh expression instantly melted back into radiant approval. She raised her free hand, gesturing grandly toward Simone. She announced that thankfully true examples of grace and feminine loyalty still existed. She proudly introduced Simone to the crowd, calling her the absolute pinnacle of the modern woman. She praised Simone for flawlessly balancing her duties as a devoted wife to Kendrick, while simultaneously building a breathtaking luxury retail empire from the ground up. She called Simone a visionary, a woman who understood that true success comes from supporting the family unit rather than competing against it. Simone preened under the spotlight. She stepped forward, allowing the golden light to catch the $50,000 diamond necklace resting against her chest. She placed a manicured hand over her heart, bowing her head in a display of manufactured humility. The crowd erupted into generous applause. The bankers, the politicians, and the socialites clapped for a woman they believed was a rising star in the luxury market. I watched them applaud a money laundering front, marveling at how easily wealth can blind intelligent people to the truth. Kendrick clapped alongside them, swaying slightly on his feet. He looked bleary-eyed and disconnected, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was publicly praising his wife while she wore diamonds bought by his brother. The dysfunction was so layered, so deeply entrenched in their psychology, that they could no longer differentiate between their lies and reality. Beatrice handed the microphone to Darren. He stepped forward, taking his mother's place at the center of the landing. He was flushed, his skin slick with a mixture of alcohol and adrenaline. He looked down at the sea of wealthy investors and powerful figures, his chest puffed out with absolute arrogance. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully cornered me into signing away my home, secured his mother's approval, and elevated his mistress in front of the entire city. Darren thanked his mother for her beautiful words. He thanked the guests for their time, dropping the names of several prominent politicians in the room to assert his dominance. He gripped the microphone, adopting his most persuasive, commanding pitch. He told the crowd that tonight was not just a celebration of family, but a celebration of unprecedented financial growth. He announced the official launch of his new venture. He called it Vanguard Legacy Partners, a highly exclusive wealth management fund designed for the ultra-elite. He boasted about his aggressive growth strategies, promising returns that defied market logic. He looked directly at the banking executives in the crowd, inviting them to join him in this new era of unprecedented prosperity. He was pitching a fraudulent fund to people who had the power to ruin him high on his own supply of deception. But Darren was not finished. He turned towards Simone, offering her a broad, predatory smile. He announced that Vanguard Legacy Partners was not just about traditional asset management. He said he believed in investing in visionary local businesses. He loudly, proudly declared to the entire room that his new fund had just entered into a major corporate partnership with Simone's luxury boutique. He stated that his firm would be injecting massive capital into her brand, facilitating a nationwide expansion that would redefine luxury retail. A collective murmur of impressed approval rippled through the ballroom. The guests clapped again, raising their glasses in a toast to this new family business alliance. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water. The cool liquid slid down my throat as a profound, chilling sense of satisfaction washed over my entire body. I could not have scripted a more perfect self-destruction if I had tried. Darren had just stood in front of a federal judge, the city mayor, and a room full of financial regulators and publicly admitted to commingling his investment funds with his mistress's business. He had just gone on the record in front of hundreds of credible witnesses, proudly announcing a financial partnership that the Securities and Exchange Commission was currently investigating as a massive money laundering operation. He had tied his public reputation directly to the exact dummy corporations I had highlighted in the dossier. He had essentially confessed to his crimes into a microphone, wrapping it in the guise of a celebratory announcement. He was digging his own social and legal grave, shoveling the dirt over his own head with every arrogant word that left his mouth. Simone blew Darren a kiss from the bottom of the stairs, her diamond necklace flashing like a beacon. Beatrice beamed, wiping a fake tear from her eye, entirely convinced she had orchestrated the ultimate triumph for her family. They stood together on that staircase, a trinity of corruption and narcissism, basking in the applause of a society they were actively defrauding. I remained in the shadows, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady. I watched Darren raise his glass of scotch, toasting to the future. I watched Beatrice accept congratulations from a city councilman. I watched Simone turn and whisper something in Kendrick's ear, a secret exchange between an extortionist and an adulterer. They thought they had buried me. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my polite smiles and accommodating behavior meant I was weak, broken, and ready to surrender my empire to their insatiable greed. They had mistaken my calculated restraint for surrender. I looked down at my phone. A single encrypted notification illuminated the screen. It was a message from Marcus. The text was brief, containing only 2 words. The message simply read, "Warrants issued." The federal machine I had activated was no longer just reviewing the data. They had moved to the execution phase. The gears of justice were actively grinding forward, racing toward the Buckhead estate to answer the call I had anonymously placed. The elaborate fantasy Darren and Beatrice had constructed was currently living on borrowed time, measured not in days but in minutes. I slipped my phone back into my evening bag and stepped out from the shadows of the marble pillar. I walked smoothly into the light, moving through the crowd with the grace of a woman who held absolute power over everything in the room. I caught Darren's eye as he descended the staircase. He smiled at me, a condescending, victorious smirk. I returned his smile with equal intensity, my eyes locking onto his with a chilling, dead focus. Let them drink their champagne. Let them celebrate their fake victories and their stolen diamonds. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. I moved through the glittering sea of Atlanta's elite with the measured, predatory grace of a woman who had already won the war. The crowd parted naturally, drawn to the quiet authority radiating from my posture. The soft hum of classical music and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes created a symphony of ignorant bliss. I kept my eyes locked on Darren. He stood on the grand landing, his chest puffed out, a smug grin plastered across his face as he raised his glass of scotch to deliver his final triumphant toast. He thought this was his coronation. He thought he had successfully manipulated the narrative, secured his fraudulent funding, and publicly humiliated me all in one masterstroke. I glided up the marble steps of the grand staircase, the heavy silk of my obsidian gown sweeping silently across the stone. Beatrice noticed me first. Her self-satisfied smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as she tried to calculate my intentions. She instinctively took a half-step toward Darren, a maternal guard dog, sensing a threat she could not quite identify. Simone shifted uncomfortably, her hand flying up to touch the cold, heavy diamonds resting against her collarbone. Kendrick simply swayed, his glazed eyes struggling to focus on my sudden approach. I did not break my stride. I offered them all a smile so warm and terrifyingly bright that it completely paralyzed them. Darren opened his mouth, drawing a breath to speak into the microphone, ready to seal his fabricated victory. I reached him in 2 swift steps. Before a single syllable could leave his lips, I placed my hand gently over his. My touch was ice cold. I smoothly, effortlessly slid the microphone from his grip. I did not snatch it. I did not fight him for it. I simply guided it away from his mouth with the practiced elegance of a devoted partner stepping in to share the spotlight. Darren's eyes widened in sheer panic, his fingers twitching as the cold metal slipped away. He was trapped. We were standing in front of the city's most powerful politicians, federal judges, and banking executives. He could not yank it back. He could not cause a scene. He was entirely at my mercy. I turned to face the ballroom. The sea of masked faces stared back at me, waiting in hushed anticipation. I let a few seconds of profound silence stretch across the room, commanding their absolute attention. I drew upon every ounce of my crisis management training, locking my professional public relations persona into place. My voice, when it echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, was smooth, melodic, and ringing with absolute authority. I welcomed our distinguished guests, thanking them for gracing our home with their presence. I told them how deeply moved I was by the incredible turnout, noting that the sheer concentration of influence and capital in this single room was a testament to the power of the Atlanta business community. I praised my husband, gesturing elegantly toward Darren with my free hand. I told the audience that Darren was a man of immense ambition, a man who constantly sought to push boundaries and redefine what was possible in wealth management. Darren stood rigid beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He forced a smile for the crowd, but up close I could see the sweat beading at his hairline. I pivoted my attention to Beatrice. I acknowledged her beautiful, impassioned speech about family legacy and traditional values. I agreed with her entirely, my voice dripping with honeyed sincerity. I told the crowd that Beatrice was absolutely right to emphasize the importance of a strong, united family front. I praised her dedication to her sons, noting how fiercely she protected their interests and guided their paths. Beatrice's eyes hardened into dark, suspicious slits. She knew me well enough to recognize a trap, but the bait was too sweet and the audience was too captivated for her to interrupt. She offered a stiff, regal nod, her hands gripping the railing of the staircase with white-knuckled intensity. Then I turned my gaze to Simone and Kendrick. I told the ballroom that family was not just about blood. It was about loyalty, trust, and shared endeavors. I highlighted Darren's exciting new announcement regarding Vanguard Legacy Partners and its corporate alliance with Simone's luxury boutique. I called it a brilliant synergy of finance and fashion, a true family enterprise built on mutual support and shared resources. Simone preened slightly under the praise, momentarily forgetting her anxiety as the crowd murmured in approval. Kendrick just blinked, looking confused by the sudden influx of positive attention. The setup was complete. I had elevated them to the highest possible pedestal. I had inflated their egos, validated their lies in front of their peers, and ensured the entire room was invested in their narrative. Now it was time to pull the foundation out from beneath their feet. I took a slow, deliberate breath, shifting my tone. The bright, welcoming cadence dropped into something more serious, more intimate. I told the distinguished guests that as a crisis manager, my entire career was built on navigating the complex intersection of public perception and private reality. I explained that I had spent years advising chief executive officers, politicians, and high net worth individuals through their most vulnerable moments. I paused, letting the weight of my professional reputation settle over the room. They knew who I was. They respected my authority. They hung on my every word. I told them that the greatest lesson I had learned in my line of work was a very simple, undeniable truth. I stated that transparency is the absolute key to any successful family and any successful business. I let the word transparency echo through the ballroom. I told the crowd that secrets are the rot that destroys foundations from the inside out. I explained that true legacy, the kind of legacy Beatrice spoke of so fondly, cannot be built in the dark. It cannot survive on half-truths, hidden agendas, or obscured financials. I said that a family enterprise must be able to withstand the harshest light of public scrutiny to truly thrive. The atmosphere in the room began to shift subtly. The polite celebratory energy morphed into a razor-sharp, captivating tension. The elite guests, many of whom harbored their own corporate secrets, leaned in closer, sensing a profound pivot in the evening's trajectory. They were sharks, and they could smell a shift in the current. I could see the city mayor tilt his head, his drink forgotten in his hand. I could see the banking executives exchanging rapid, silent glances. Darren shifted his weight, stepping half a pace toward me. He leaned in, his voice, a desperate, harsh whisper meant only for my ears. He told me that was enough. He ordered me to wrap it up and give him the microphone back. I did not even look at him. I simply shifted my shoulder, expertly blocking his advance without breaking my connection with the audience. I smiled out at the sea of masks, projecting total command. I told the room that tonight, in the spirit of absolute transparency and in honor of the launch of Vanguard Legacy Partners, we were going to share something truly unprecedented. I announced that we were going to open the books. We were going to show Atlanta exactly how this family operated, how Darren built his wealth, and exactly where the capital for Simone's brilliant boutique originated. I promised them a masterclass in modern financial synergy. Darren froze completely. The blood rushed from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked like a man standing on the tracks, staring down the headlights of a freight train. Beatrice let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying to her throat. She finally understood. The naive, accommodating daughter-in-law was an illusion. The trap had sprung and its jaws were lined with steel. Simone's hand dropped from her diamond necklace, her mouth falling slightly open in rising panic. I did not give them a single second to recover, intervene, or formulate an escape plan. I kept my eyes locked on the crowd, holding them completely spellbound. I raised my left hand and made a subtle, sharp gesture toward the back of the massive room. Rosa was stationed perfectly by the main audiovisual control panel, obscured by the heavy velvet drapes near the catering entrance. She had been waiting for this exact signal. She saw my hand raise and she executed the command with flawless precision. Instantly, the grand, sparkling chandeliers hanging above the ballroom dimmed to a dull, low glow. The sudden reduction in light caused a collective murmur of surprise to ripple through the crowd. The warm, inviting ambiance evaporated, replaced by a cool, clinical darkness. The string quartet, unsure of what was happening, stopped plucking their instruments entirely. Then came the mechanical hum. From the mezzanine level directly above the grand staircase, massive velvet drapes parted mechanically. A colossal high-definition projector screen spanning 20 feet across descended slowly from the ceiling. The electric motor whirred the sound loud and ominous in the suddenly quiet room. The screen locked into place behind the landing directly above where Darren, Beatrice, Simone, Kendrick, and I were standing. A bright, glaring beam of blue light shot across the room from the projection booth, hitting the screen with a sharp snap. The jarring, unnatural light cast long, distorted shadows across the faces of the wealthy elite below. The celebratory chatter died instantly. The laughter evaporated. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. The transition was violent and immediate. The opulent masquerade gala had vanished. The room shifted from a glamorous high society celebration to a suffocating dead-silent interrogation chamber. Every single masked face in the ballroom turned upward, their eyes locked onto the glowing digital canvas, waiting for the truth to be exposed. A sharp, definitive click resonated through the state-of-the-art speakers as Rosa advanced to the very first slide. The brilliant, blinding blue backdrop dissolved instantly, replaced by a high-resolution, brutally clear image of a redacted banking ledger. The numbers were magnified to massive proportions, practically glowing in the dim, cool light of the ballroom. A thick, aggressively red box highlighted a specific, undeniable line item. The text within the box was massive. It read, $850,000 transferred, Vanguard Client Escrow to Simone Lux Boutique Holding Corp. Darren's brain finally caught up to the catastrophic reality of his destruction. The arrogant, untouchable facade shattered entirely, replaced by raw, animalistic panic. He let out a guttural, furious shout, lunging forward across the marble landing. His hands were outstretched fingers, hooked like claws, desperate to rip the microphone from my grasp and tear the projector screen down by brute force. He did not make it past the second step. I had not left a single variable to chance. Two men in crisp, tailored black suits materialized from the deep shadows behind the sweeping curve of the staircase. They were part of an elite, highly discreet private security detail I had hired weeks ago, instructed to blend in as event staff until this exact moment. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Before Darren's hands could even graze the silk of my dress, they intercepted him. The guard on the left grabbed Darren's right arm, twisting it firmly and painfully behind his back with practiced ease. The guard on the right planted a heavy, immovable hand flat against Darren's chest, halting his frantic momentum instantly and pinning him against the heavy mahogany banister. Darren struggled wildly, his expensive custom tuxedo twisting awkwardly around his shoulders. He kicked out his polished leather shoes, scrambling for purchase on the marble stairs. He yelled at me, his voice cracking with rage, demanding I turn off the screen, demanding someone cut the power to the house. But Rosa had already locked the audiovisual control room from the inside. Darren was immobilized, trapped on his own grand staircase, forced to watch his execution unfold. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my voice perfectly measured, allowing the microphone to amplify the absolute chilling calm of my delivery over the sound of his frantic struggling. I turned back to the audience. Many of the faces staring up at me, illuminated by the harsh light of the projector, belonged to the very men and women who had entrusted their generational wealth to my husband. I spoke directly to them. I explained that the document displayed behind me was an unredacted internal ledger lifted directly from the shadow servers of Vanguard Legacy Partners. I stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, that the $850,000 transferred was not a strategic investment. It was not a secured loan. It was not a legitimate business expense sanctioned by any board of directors. I told them exactly what it was. It was a direct, unauthorized diversion of client escrow funds. I let my gaze sweep over the banking executives, the federal judges, and the city officials. I named the specific, supposedly secure escrow accounts that had been drained. I detailed with clinical precision how the money had been systematically siphoned from conservative retirement portfolios. I explained how Darren had funneled their hard-earned capital directly into a network of dummy corporations entities specifically designed to look like overseas vendors supplying inventory for his sister-in-law's luxury boutique. A low, dangerous rumble began to build in the ballroom. The polite high society silence fractured like thin ice under heavy boots. The elite guests were no longer a captive audience enjoying a gala. They were a room full of highly powerful, incredibly wealthy individuals realizing they had just been robbed blind. Men in tailored tuxedos began pointing furiously at the screen. Women ripped their decorative masks off their faces, their eyes wide with genuine panic. Dozens of guests simultaneously pulled their phones from their pockets, frantically dialing their private legal counsel and asset managers. The politicians and public figures who had just been clapping for Darren now physically backed away from the staircase, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the blast radius of a massive federal felony. I raised my hand, signaling Rosa for the next slide. Another loud click echoed through the room. The screen shifted. The new document displayed an intercepted wire transfer receipt, displayed alongside an official itemized invoice from Atlanta's most exclusive appointment-only jeweler. The amount highlighted again in that blinding accusatory red was exactly $50,000. The origin account listed on the wire transfer was not a Vanguard corporate account. It was another client trust fund. I turned my body slightly, gesturing gracefully toward Simone with my free hand. She was frozen near the grand fireplace, looking like a deer paralyzed in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Her face was chalk white beneath her crimson lace mask. The proprietary, arrogant posture she had carried all evening had completely evaporated. She looked small, terrified, and utterly exposed. I spoke into the microphone, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the room. I told the audience to look closely at the beautiful, shining example of the modern woman standing before them. I asked them to admire the breathtaking diamond tennis necklace currently resting against her collarbone. I stated, my voice ringing with cold, hard facts, that the necklace was a custom-commissioned piece. I listed the exact carat weight. I named the exclusive designer. Then I pointed directly to the glowing screen above me. I told the entire room that the $50,000 used to purchase those massive, flawless diamonds was wired directly from the private retirement account of a specific investor standing right here in this room. I locked eyes with the older, distinguished gentleman Darren had been aggressively schmoozing earlier in the evening. He was standing near the towering ice sculpture, his champagne glass trembling in his hand. The man's face dropped in absolute, unadulterated horror. I watched the blood drain from his cheeks as the mathematical reality hit him. His life savings, the money he had spent 40 years accumulating, was currently draped around the neck of Darren's mistress as a sparkling party favor. The ballroom completely erupted. The low rumble exploded into a deafening cacophony of outrage, furious gasps, and screaming demands. The illusion of high society decorum vanished entirely, replaced by the primal, terrifying energy of a mob that had just been financially ruined. Investors shoved past one another, surging angrily toward the bottom of the grand staircase. They pointed accusatory fingers at Darren, screaming for their money, shouting threats of lawsuits and physical violence. Simone let out a high-pitched, terrified shriek as a furious socialite threw a heavy crystal glass of champagne directly at her feet. The glass shattered violently, sending sharp shards and expensive alcohol splashing against Simone's designer heels. Simone frantically grabbed at her neck, her manicured fingers clawing desperately at the diamond clasp. She was trying to take the stolen necklace off, trying to physically separate herself from the evidence of the crime, but her hands were shaking too violently to undo the intricate security latch. She whimpered, pulling at the chain until it dug painfully into her skin, her eyes darting around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. Kendrick, previously intoxicated and happily swaying to the music, suddenly snapped into stark, brutal sobriety. He stood a few feet away from Simone, his eyes darting from the bank statements on the massive projector screen down to the diamonds choking his wife. He stared at the transfer details routing hundreds of thousands of dollars to Simone's boutique. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The money, the necklace, the secret glances across the room. His brother had not just been illegally funding his wife's business. His brother had been buying his wife. Kendrick let out a sound that was half sob, half roar, taking a staggering step away from Simone as if she had suddenly caught fire. Beatrice looked like she was having a catastrophic medical event. She stood clutching the heavy mahogany railing of the staircase, her knuckles completely white. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her eyes bulging as they darted frantically between the glaring, undeniable evidence on the digital screen and her precious golden child being manhandled by security guards. The grand, untouchable legacy she had just spent 10 minutes bragging about to the city's elite was burning to ash in real time. She let out a strangled cry and tried to move toward Darren, but the sheer wall of angry investors surging at the bottom of the stairs trapped her on the landing. She tried to yell, tried to command the room to be silent, to assert her matriarchal dominance and fix the disaster. But her voice was completely drowned out by the roar of the defrauded crowd. No one was listening to Beatrice anymore. The queen of the castle had been entirely stripped of her power, reduced to a desperate, panicked woman, watching her fraudulent empire collapse into dust. Darren stopped struggling against the security guards. He went completely limp, his chin dropping to his chest as the reality of his total annihilation washed over him. The wealthy men and women he had spent years trying to impress were currently screaming for his head. The business he had stolen from me was exposed as a criminal syndicate. His mother was trapped, his brother was broken, and his mistress was sobbing in the corner, clawing at her own throat. I stood above the absolute chaos, perfectly still, my breathing calm and even. The blue light from the projector illuminated my obsidian gown, casting me as the architect of their destruction. I had not just taken back my power, I had surgically, methodically dismantled their entire world, exposing the ugly, rotting truth beneath their golden masks. The trap had snapped shut, breaking every bone in their collective ambition, and the execution was flawlessly complete. Even as the reality of their absolute ruin settled over the ballroom, the sheer force of male ego propelled Kendrick forward. He could not accept the public humiliation of being exposed as a cuckolded husband whose lifestyle was subsidized by his brother's criminal infidelity. The murmurs of the elite crowd were entirely focused on his wife's stolen diamonds, and the humiliation was burning through Kendrick's veins. He lunged in front of Simone, shielding her trembling body from the glaring spotlight of the projector. He raised his hands, gesturing wildly toward the furious investors and the stunned politicians. He shouted that this was a lie. He screamed over the deafening noise of the crowd, his voice cracking with desperate performative outrage. He pointed a shaking finger up at me, standing poised on the grand staircase. He told the room that I was a bitter, hysterical woman trying to tear down a successful family because my own marriage was failing. He yelled that Simone was a brilliant entrepreneur, that her boutique was legitimate, and that I had fabricated these documents to cover my own inadequacies. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the image of a strong, protective husband defending his innocent wife from a malicious smear campaign. It was a pathetic, transparent display of a weak man trying to salvage a reputation that was already ashes. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply brought the microphone back to my lips and signaled Rosa with a slight nod. The massive screen behind me blinked the image of the stolen escrow funds vanishing. In its place, a new set of financial records illuminated the ballroom in cold, unforgiving light. These were not corporate bank statements. They were offshore betting ledgers, digital wire transfers, and aggressive collection notices from underground sportsbooks. I looked down at Kendrick, my voice echoing with surgical precision. I told him to drop the act. I told the entire room that Kendrick was not a victim. I explained that a man cannot be a victim when he actively sells his silence. I directed the crowd's attention to the highlighted figures on the screen. Over $300,000 in gambling debts. The dates aligned perfectly with Kendrick's sudden unexplained absences over the past 2 years. I read the numbers aloud, my voice cutting through Kendrick's frantic denials. I showed the room exactly how deep in the hole Kendrick had dug himself, placing bets on offshore servers owing money to dangerous people who did not send polite collection letters. Then I signaled Rosa for the next slide. The screen split in two. On the left were Kendrick's massive debts. On the right were the corresponding payments. Every single one of those debts had been cleared by Vanguard Legacy Partners. I laid the truth bare for everyone to see. I explained that Darren had not just paid off his brother's catastrophic gambling losses out of familial love. It was a transaction. I told the crowd that Darren paid Kendrick's debts, and in exchange, Kendrick looked the other way while Darren funded Simone's business and shared her bed. I stated that Kendrick had explicitly allowed his brother to carry on a prolonged, lavish affair with his wife because the alternative meant facing the reality of his own financial ruin. He had traded his dignity for debt relief. Kendrick stopped shouting. The fake bravado drained from his body as rapidly as blood from a severed artery. The high society guests stared at him in absolute disgust. The men who had previously humored him at country club mixers now looked at him like he was an infection. He was not just a fool. He was a willing accomplice to his own degradation. Kendrick's shoulders slumped. He looked back at Simone, but there was no righteous fury left in his eyes, only the hollow, vacant stare of a man who had sold his soul and still ended up bankrupt. He stumbled backward, retreating into the crowd, leaving Simone completely alone in the glaring light. The destruction of her sons finally pushed Beatrice past the point of sanity. The carefully crafted persona of the gracious, aristocratic Southern matriarch violently shattered. She shoved her way past the stunned investors on the landing, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She was panting, her chest heaving under her expensive silver gown. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me. She shrieked, the sound raw and guttural, devoid of any etiquette or restraint. She called me a monster. She called me a manipulative viper who had slithered into her family solely to poison them against one another. She screamed that I was jealous of their legacy, that I was a classless outsider trying to destroy generations of hard work, because I could never truly belong in their world. Her voice grew louder, reaching a hysterical pitch that echoed painfully through the ballroom. She demanded that the security guards release Darren immediately. She ordered the technicians to cut the power to the projector. When no one moved, when the private security detail I had hired remained perfectly still, pinning Darren to the banister, she turned her wrath entirely on me. She commanded me to leave. She screamed that I was completely finished in this city. She threw her arm toward the grand double doors of the foyer, her voice tearing through her throat. She ordered me to get out of her son's house. She yelled that I had no right to stand in this magnificent estate and insult the family that owned it. She declared that she was the matriarch, that this was her bloodline's domain, and she was officially throwing me out into the street where I belonged. I stood perfectly still, letting her hysterical screams wash over me. I allowed the crowd to witness the ugly, entitled reality of Beatrice. I waited until she was entirely out of breath, until the echo of her screeching command faded into the heavy, judgmental silence of the ballroom. Then I reached into the sleek designer evening bag hanging from my shoulder. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered. The audience watched in total fascination as I retrieved a thick, crisp stack of legal documents. The paper felt heavy and powerful in my hands. I held the documents up, ensuring the bright blue light of the projector caught the embossed gold seal of the Fulton County Deeds Office. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an executioner lowering the blade. I spoke into the microphone, my voice dropping to a low, deadly purr that demanded absolute silence. I told Beatrice that she was confused. I explained that she was operating under a massive fundamental delusion regarding the reality of her surroundings. I signaled Rosa one final time. The massive screen shifted from Kendrick's gambling debts to a high-resolution scan of the property deed for the Buckhead estate. The red highlight box zeroed in on the official ownership registry. I told Beatrice to look at the screen. I told the entire room to read the name of the legal owner. The estate was not owned by Darren. It was not owned by Vanguard Legacy Partners. It was not a piece of her sacred family legacy. The property was owned entirely, completely, and unconditionally by Obsidian Holdings, LLC. I let that fact settle over the room. I explained that Obsidian Holdings was a private corporate entity of which I was the sole 100% owner and managing director. I detailed how years ago, when Darren had faced a sudden liquidity crisis, I had quietly purchased the estate through my firm to prevent foreclosure. I had allowed him to tell his mother and his friends that he had bought it. I had allowed him to play the role of the wealthy master of the house because it suited my professional need for a stable public image. I looked directly down into Beatrice's horrified, bulging eyes. I told her that her son did not own a single brick, a single blade of grass, or a single crystal in the chandeliers of this estate. I stated that Darren was legally speaking nothing more than a guest in my home, and as of this exact moment, his invitation had been permanently revoked. Beatrice's jaw went slack. The absolute certainty of her power, her entire sense of identity was tethered to the illusion of this house and her son's manufactured wealth. I had just vaporized it. I was not finished. I raised the stack of documents in my hand, tapping the edge against the microphone. I told the audience that this was the kind of transparency that terrified people like Darren and Beatrice. I explained that just yesterday they had attempted one final desperate maneuver to save themselves from the federal investigation they knew was closing in. I revealed the post-nuptial contract. I detailed its contents to the silent, captivated room. I explained how they had tried to force me into signing a legally binding agreement that would have transferred the ownership of my crisis management firm entirely to Darren. They wanted my legitimate, highly profitable business to act as a shield and a financial backstop for his catastrophic criminal losses. They had tried to steal my life's work to pay back the very investors who were currently standing in my foyer demanding their money. I looked at Darren, who was still pinned against the mahogany banister. The fight had completely left his body. He looked hollow, destroyed, staring blankly at the marble steps. I looked at Simone, who was weeping silently on the floor, her stolen necklace discarded nearby. I looked at Kendrick, who had vanished into the angry crowd, hiding from his own shame. Finally, I looked back at Beatrice. The grand matriarch was physically shaking. The elite guests, the politicians, the judges, and the executives she had spent her entire life trying to impress were looking at her with absolute revulsion. She was no longer a queen. She was a fraud, a mother who had fostered a criminal enterprise and tried to feed her daughter-in-law to the wolves to save her own skin. Her facade was utterly obliterated. There was no recovery from this. There was no spinning this narrative. I had burned their empire to the ground, and I owned the land it was built on. Everything they had was mine, and now they had absolutely nothing left. The execution was complete. The Federal Bureau of Investigation warrants were inbound. I stood tall, the deed in my hand, breathing in the sweet, intoxicating air of absolute victory. The deafening silence that followed my declaration did not last long. It was broken not by the gasps of the Atlanta elite or the pathetic whimpers of my shattered in-laws, but by a high and piercing wail bleeding through the thick glass of the conservatory windows. At first, it was a distant vibrating hum carrying through the humid night air. Within seconds, it amplified into a shrieking, multitonal chorus of approaching sirens. The flashing red and blue lights began to stroke violently across the manicured lawns, projecting a chaotic strobe effect through the grand foyer windows and into the opulent ballroom. The cavalry had arrived right on schedule to collect the garbage. The sound acted like a starting pistol for the wealthy guests. The momentary paralysis induced by my presentation evaporated instantly, replaced by raw, visceral panic. The ballroom devolved into a frenzied scramble of self-preservation. Silver trays crashed to the marble floor as event staff abandoned their posts to get out of the way. The federal judge, realizing the catastrophic optical implications of attending a gala hosted by a fraudster, made a frantic beeline for the side exit, abandoning his wife in the rush. Bank executives and corporate titans stumbled over themselves, frantically dialing their private legal counsel and wealth managers. I watched the city mayor speaking aggressively into his phone, likely mobilizing his crisis team to distance his administration from Vanguard legacy partners before the morning news cycle could even begin. They were desperate to pull whatever funds they could salvage, desperate to scrub their names from Darren's radioactive, toxic ledger before the collateral damage ruined them all. The heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the estate did not just open, they were violently breached. A tactical wave of federal agents flooded into the grand foyer. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. They wore dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow acronyms of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Their sudden imposing presence sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The music had stopped long ago, but now even the frantic whispers of the guests died down to an absolute hush. Atlanta's highest society parted like the Red Sea, backing away with their hands raised, desperate to avoid catching the attention of the federal investigators marching through their ranks. The lead agent, a tall man with a chiseled jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped to the base of the grand staircase. He did not look at the fleeing politicians or the terrified socialites. His eyes locked entirely onto Darren. My private security detail stepped back in perfect unison, relinquishing their physical hold on my husband, but keeping his escape routes firmly sealed. Darren stood shivering on the marble landing. His expensive custom tuxedo, tailored to project the illusion of limitless power and generational wealth, now looked like a tragically ironic costume. He was completely trapped in the blinding glare of the projector screen, his financial crimes still broadcasting in massive red numbers directly above his head for the federal agents to admire. The agents ascended the stairs with heavy, echoing footsteps. The lead agent recited Darren's full legal name, his voice booming with absolute authority, cutting through the remaining ambient noise of the ballroom. He announced that Darren was being placed under arrest for wire fraud, grand larceny, money laundering, and a litany of federal securities violations. Darren did not speak. The charismatic, persuasive orator, who had captivated this exact audience just 20 minutes prior, was entirely gone. He offered no silver-tongued defense. He attempted no charming manipulation. He simply raised his wrists, his face hollow and devoid of blood, surrendering to his inevitable reality. The cold metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply around the silent room. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of a fraudulent empire collapsing into rubble. The federal agents flanked him physically, turning him around to face the crowd one last time. It was the ultimate public humiliation. The same investors he had swindled, the same politicians he had bribed, and the same society figures he had tried to impress, watched as he was paraded down the grand staircase like a common thief. Camera flashes from a few bold guests illuminated his descent, capturing his ruin for the morning papers. Darren kept his eyes glued to his expensive leather shoes, unable to meet the gaze of the people he had robbed. He was escorted out the massive double doors, disappearing into the flashing red and blue lights of the federal convoy waiting in the circular driveway. With Darren gone, the spotlight of consequence immediately swung to the remnants of his family. The matriarchal facade Beatrice had clung to for decades had completely disintegrated. She was sprawled awkwardly on the third step of the staircase, her silver gown bunched up around her knees, looking entirely ridiculous. She was hyperventilating, clawing at her own chest, as if she could physically tear the anxiety out of her lungs. The grand illusion of the untouchable Southern dynasty was dead. Everyone in the room now knew she was the mother of a federally indicted felon, a woman who had tried to extort her own daughter-in-law to cover up a criminal enterprise. She was socially and financially ruined, destined to become a pariah in the very circles she had spent her entire life trying to dominate. Kendrick was leaning heavily against a marble column near the bar, looking as though he might vomit. The revelation of his wife's infidelity and his brother's financial blackmail had stripped him of every ounce of his false bravado. He stared blankly at the floor, a broken, pathetic man who had willingly traded his self-respect to clear his offshore gambling debts. He was a spectator to his own destruction, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public emasculation. Simone was in an even worse state. She was kneeling on the polished floor, her elaborate crimson dress stained with spilled champagne and trampled by fleeing guests. She was sobbing hysterically, her hands covering her face, rocking back and forth in a state of total breakdown. The $50,000 diamond necklace, the symbol of her stolen triumph and arrogance, lay discarded like a piece of cheap glass a few feet away. The SEC agents had already dispatched a secondary team to secure her boutique's financial records. She was not just a disgraced mistress, she was an active accomplice in a federal money laundering scheme. Her future held nothing but brutal depositions, asset seizures, and potentially a lengthy prison sentence of her own. I watched them from the landing, my posture relaxed, the deed to the estate still held loosely in my hand. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. They had conspired to destroy my life, strip me of my hard-earned business, and leave me with the wreckage of their crimes. I had simply returned the favor with far greater precision and flawless execution. I descended the staircase, my movements slow and deliberate. I stopped a few feet away from where Beatrice was sobbing on the steps. I did not raise my voice, but the chilling authority in my tone made her flinch violently. I reminded her that as of 10 minutes ago, she was officially trespassing on private corporate property. I looked over at Kendrick, then down at Simone groveling on the floor. I stated that my charity had officially run out and their presence was no longer required or tolerated. I raised my hand, signaling the captain of my private security detail. The broad-shouldered man stepped forward instantly, standing at attention and awaiting my command. I instructed him and his elite team to escort these 3 individuals off my property immediately. I told him that they were not allowed to collect their coats from the cloakroom. They were not permitted to make any phone calls. They were to be physically removed from the premises and deposited outside the front gates of the estate. I added a final unyielding directive. If they resisted in any way, I authorized the team to physically carry them to the street. I made it perfectly clear that if any of them ever set foot on my land again, they were to be treated as hostile intruders and handed directly over to the local police department without hesitation. The security guards moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency. 2 men grabbed Beatrice by the arms, hauling her unceremoniously to her feet. She shrieked, kicking her heels, demanding they unhand her, screaming wildly about her social standing and her rights. The guards ignored her, completely dragging the disgraced matriarch toward the front doors while she thrashed like a captured animal. Another guard approached Kendrick. To his credit, Kendrick did not put up a fight. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumped in total agonizing defeat, and allowed himself to be escorted out. He walked with the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man marching toward his own execution. Simone required significantly more force. When a guard reached for her arm, she scrambled backward like a crab, sobbing wildly and pleading with me to help her. She cried out that Darren had forced her into everything, that she was just an innocent pawn in his grand scheme. I looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice, offering absolutely nothing in return. 2 security guards lifted her by her elbows, carrying her bodily toward the exit, as her crimson heels dragged across the polished marble floor. Her hysterical cries echoed through the grand foyer, growing fainter and fainter, until the heavy wooden doors finally swung shut behind her with a definitive thud. The estate was suddenly profoundly quiet. The federal agents had secured their target and their digital evidence. The panicked guests had successfully fled to their luxury vehicles, eager to escape the epicenter of the scandal and call their accountants. Rosa emerged from the audiovisual control room, walking quietly to my side. She looked around the empty, slightly disheveled ballroom, then up at me, a fierce, proud smile playing on her lips. The masquerade was over. The criminals had been hauled away. The leeches had been forcefully expelled from my home. I stood in the center of my magnificent foyer, entirely alone, completely victorious, and finally free to rebuild my empire exactly the way I wanted. 6 months passed with the swift, unforgiving momentum of a perfectly executed corporate takeover. The dust from the Vanguard Legacy Partners implosion finally settled, leaving a radically altered, scorched earth landscape in its wake. The suffocating tension that had once defined my marriage was entirely replaced by a serene, unshakable peace. Obsidian Holdings was thriving. My crisis management firm experienced unprecedented explosive growth as Atlanta's elite realized the immense value of a woman who could dismantle a criminal empire without breaking a single sweat. I had reclaimed my life entirely, but the wreckage of the Vanguard collapse was still actively, methodically crushing the people who had tried to bury me. The federal justice system does not care about bespoke tuxedos, country club memberships, or manufactured Southern charm. Darren's trial was brief, brutal, and highly publicized. The mountain of digital evidence I had meticulously gathered and handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation left his high-priced defense attorneys completely paralyzed. They had no counter-narrative, no viable loopholes, and no scapegoat left to sacrifice. Every unauthorized wire transfer, every dummy corporation, and every doctored ledger was laid bare before a jury of his peers. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse on the day of his sentencing, wearing a pristine, tailored white suit, projecting the absolute calm of a surviving victim who had emerged from the ashes. The presiding judge did not mince words. He looked down from the bench and called Darren a financial predator in a pinstripe suit, a man who had systematically pillaged the life savings of vulnerable, hard-working investors simply to fund an arrogant, unsustainable illusion of grandeur. When the heavy wooden gavel finally fell, the sentence was absolute and crushing. 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole, followed by millions of dollars in mandatory crippling restitution. Darren turned to look at me as the armed marshals approached to escort him toward the holding cells. His face was gaunt, his skin possessing a sickly, fluorescent institutional pallor. The boundless arrogance that had once defined his every movement was completely eradicated, replaced by the hollow, terrified realization that he was about to trade his luxury estate for a concrete box and a steel toilet. I did not offer him a parting smile. I did not offer a nod. I simply held his gaze with cold, dead eyes until the heavy courtroom doors swung shut and swallowed him whole. The collateral damage extending from Darren's conviction decimated Kendrick and Simone with absolute, terrifying precision. The Internal Revenue Service moved with blinding speed, treating Simone's luxury boutique not as a legitimate high-end enterprise, but as a direct depository for stolen, laundered funds. The raid happened on a busy Tuesday afternoon, a spectacle witnessed by dozens of shoppers on the affluent avenue. Federal agents descended on the storefront, seizing every piece of inventory, freezing every associated bank account, and chaining the glass doors shut with a heavy steel padlock and a neon seizure notice. The $50,000 diamond tennis necklace had already been confiscated as federal evidence on the night of the gala, but the government systematically stripped Simone of everything else she owned to satisfy the outstanding tax liabilities and fraud penalties. Her glamorous, highly curated life evaporated overnight. This total financial destruction instantly catalyzed the spectacular, deeply public detonation of her marriage to Kendrick. Their divorce proceedings were a bloody, chaotic spectacle that provided endless, vicious entertainment for Atlanta's local gossip blogs. Kendrick, desperate to salvage his own shattered pride and publicly distance himself from the criminal fallout, attempted to drag Simone through the mud. He leaked embarrassing, intimate details of her affair with his brother and her gross financial incompetence to anyone who would listen. Simone viciously retaliated by exposing his massive, pathetic offshore gambling debts, releasing screenshots of his frantic pleas to Darren for money. They tore each other to pieces in the digital public square, completely destroying whatever microscopic shreds of social standing they had left. Kendrick ended up moving into a cheap transient motel on the industrial outskirts of the city, working a mid-level, commission-only sales job he absolutely despised, forever branded as the fool who let his older brother buy his wife. Simone vanished from the social scene entirely, her reputation a toxic radioactive wasteland, forced to move back in with her estranged parents in a neighboring state. But the most profound, deeply satisfying decline belonged to Beatrice. The aristocratic matriarchal facade she had spent decades meticulously constructing was utterly pulverized. The wealthy socialites' charity board directors and powerful politicians she had considered her loyal peers dropped her instantly and completely. In high society, poverty and public scandal are highly contagious diseases, and Beatrice was patient zero. She was permanently ousted from her prestigious charitable boards. Her lifetime country club membership was unceremoniously revoked, and her phone stopped ringing entirely. The aggressive, desperate legal defense she initially attempted to mount for Darren completely drained her non-existent financial reserves. She was forced to rapidly liquidate her few remaining authentic assets, selling off her vintage jewelry and inherited antique furniture to pawn shops just to keep her head above water. When the eviction notice finally arrived for her upscale condominium, there was absolutely no one left to bail her out. The former queen of Southern aristocracy was forced to pack her remaining clothes into garbage bags and move into a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment in a decaying building miles away from the affluent neighborhoods she used to dominate. I had driven past it once out of sheer undeniable curiosity. The building featured peeling, sun-bleached paint, a rusted chain-link fence surrounding a cracked asphalt parking lot, and a flickering neon sign above a nearby discount liquor store. It was the ultimate poetic justice. The woman who had sneered at my origins, who had called me a classless outsider and treated me like hired help, was now permanently trapped in the very environment she had always openly despised. She had nothing but the suffocating, inescapable reality of her own failure to keep her company. It was late on a Friday afternoon when my private office line rang. I was sitting at my massive glass desk finalizing the lucrative acquisition of a rival public relations firm, enjoying the quiet, industrious hum of the city traffic far below. I glanced at the caller identification display. It was an unknown, unregistered number, but my instincts immediately recognized the desperate persistence of the ringing. I let it chime 4 times before calmly lifting the receiver. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened to the heavy trembling, uneven breathing on the other end of the line. The voice that finally spoke was fragile, hoarse, and completely stripped of all its former aristocratic arrogance. It was Beatrice. She did not attempt small talk, she did not try to weaponize guilt, and she did not dare invoke the supposedly sacred bonds of family. The harsh realities of her new life had beaten her down to her absolute lowest denominator. She begged. Her voice cracked and hitched as she told me about the leaking rusted pipes in her cramped bathroom, the constant smell of mildew in the dark hallways, and the aggressive collection agencies calling her relentlessly at all hours of the night. She cried actual desperate, pathetic tears, explaining that her electricity was scheduled to be shut off by Monday morning because she could not afford the utility bill. She pleaded with me, her words stumbling over one another, asking for a small loan and advance, any kind of financial lifeline. She reminded me of my vast, expanding wealth, of the massive Buckhead estate I now owned outright, and sobbed that surely I could spare a fraction of my resources to keep an old woman from freezing in the dark. I let her finish. I let her empty every single ounce of her dignity onto the floor of my impeccable temperature-controlled office. I listened to the pathetic, wheezing silence that followed her desperate, weeping plea. I analyzed my own internal response and found absolutely nothing. My heart rate did not elevate. My breathing remained perfectly slow and controlled. I felt no pity, no triumph, no anger. I sat back in my plush leather chair, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, glittering Atlanta skyline that I was rapidly conquering. When I finally spoke, my voice was a smooth, icy blade, cutting cleanly through the phone line. I told Beatrice that I appreciated her updating me on her current living situation. I told her that the squalor she described sounded like a remarkably fitting, appropriate environment for someone with such a deeply rotting, corrupt core. I kept my tone conversational, entirely devoid of anger or malice, projecting the absolute chilling detachment of a busy executive swatting away a minor, irrelevant annoyance. Beatrice let out a strangled, horrified gasp, clearly shocked by the sheer, impenetrable coldness of my response. She tried to interrupt, tried to frantically invoke Darren's name, tried to remind me that she was once my mother-in-law and that family was supposed to forgive. I cut her off instantly. I told her that my charity was permanently closed to parasites. I reminded her of the night she stood on my grand staircase and tried to throw me out of my own home to protect a thief. I reminded her of the fraudulent illegal contract she had tried to force down my throat to cover her son's federal crimes. I explained with clinical precision that she had fundamentally misunderstood my nature from the very moment we first met. She thought I was a naive, pliable outsider, desperate for her toxic approval. She thought I was a convenient stepping stone for her family's manufactured hollow legacy. I took a slow, deliberate breath, leaning forward slightly toward the receiver. I delivered the final, undeniable truth with absolute crushing finality. I was born to build my own empire, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper, not to clean up your son's messes. I did not wait for a response. I did not need to hear her subsequent sobbing or her desperate, panicked apologies. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle with a soft, definitive click, severing the connection entirely. I immediately accessed the phone's administrative settings and permanently blocked the number, erasing her from my existence. The silence that filled my office was absolute, pure, and deeply satisfying. I picked up my customized gold pen, turned my attention back to the multi-million-dollar acquisition contract resting on my desk, and went back to work. Later that evening, I left the corporate tower behind and returned to the sanctuary of the Buckhead estate. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, sealing out the noise of the city and the frantic energy of my day. I poured myself a generous glass of a rare vintage Bordeaux and made my way up the sweeping marble staircase to the master suite. I bypassed the massive, newly emptied bedroom and pushed open the French doors leading out onto the private balcony. The night air was warm, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and wet earth from a brief afternoon storm. I leaned against the cool stone balustrade, swirling the dark ruby liquid in my glass. For the first time in years, the silence surrounding me was not a weapon. It was not a tense, suffocating quiet waiting to be broken by Darren's lies or Beatrice's condescension. It was pure, unadulterated peace. It was the sound of complete ownership. The soft click of the French doors opening broke my reverie. I turned to see Rosa stepping out onto the balcony, holding a silver tray laden with a beautifully arranged plate of roasted vegetables and seared salmon. She moved with a quiet, confident grace, no longer the anxious employee, forced to tiptoe around a tyrannical matriarch. This house was as much her sanctuary now as it was mine. She set the tray down on the wrought iron patio table and offered me a warm, knowing smile. I set my wineglass down and took her hands in mine. I looked directly into her eyes, letting the full weight of my gratitude surface. I told her that absolutely none of this would have been possible without her. I reminded her of that terrifying, brave phone call she made months ago, risking her own livelihood and safety, to warn me about the discrepancies in the escrow accounts and the late-night visits to the study. I told Rosa she was the true catalyst for my freedom. She had handed me the first thread, and together we had unraveled a criminal empire. Rosa squeezed my hands tightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and told me that loyalty is earned by those who protect their own. She wished me a good night and slipped quietly back into the house, leaving me alone with the stars. I picked my wine back up, letting my gaze sweep across the rolling, manicured lawns of my property. The estate was completely silent, standing as a massive stone monument to my survival. The journey from being an underestimated, disregarded wife to the sole owner of a thriving corporate empire had demanded a brutal, unflinching transformation. I had learned the hardest, most vital lesson of my life. Peace is not a passive state. It is not something you wish for, and it is certainly not something you can negotiate with emotional terrorists. Peace is a fortress, and it must be defended with lethal force. I realized that my previous willingness to compromise my desire to keep the peace and placate Darren's fragile ego had been an open invitation for exploitation. Predators do not respect compromise. They view it as a weakness to be bled dry. I had to build ironclad boundaries forged in legal contracts and absolute emotional detachment to protect my sanity and my assets. The most dangerous myth society forces upon us is the concept of unconditional family loyalty. We are taught that shared DNA, shared last name, or a marriage certificate somehow excuses a lifetime of disrespect, manipulation, and theft. It is a lie designed to keep victims compliant and silent. I had to learn to look at the people closest to me with absolute chilling objectivity. When Darren chose to drain his client's accounts to fund his mistress, he stopped being my husband. When Beatrice decided to throw me to the federal wolves to save her son, she relinquished any claim to familial respect. Toxicity does not deserve a seat at your table just because it shares your bloodline or wears a wedding ring. You owe absolutely nothing to people who treat your existence as a resource to be plundered. Protecting your empire requires the courage to identify the rot, isolate it, and amputate it without a single shred of hesitation or guilt. I had cut the infection out of my life, and in doing so, I had saved myself. My mind was clear, my conscience was clean, and my future was completely unbound by the anchors of a fraudulent family. I took one final savoring sip of my wine, feeling the rich flavor ground me in the present moment. The nightmare was over, and the dawn of my new reality was entirely mine to command. But my story is not just a tale of corporate revenge. It is a testament to the power of reclaiming your narrative and demanding the respect you deserve. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a toxic cycle of family loyalty? Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand and enforce brutal, necessary boundaries against the people who were supposed to love you? Drop your stories in the comments below. Let us build a community of survivors who refuse to be diminished. If this journey of reclaiming power, demanding justice, and protecting your peace resonated with you, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of triumph over adversity. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Never let anyone convince you it is up for negotiation. Guard your empire, trust your instincts, and never apologize for securing your own freedom.